Alrighty, good afternoon, everyone. Wonderful to have you along again today. Topic today that I guess in that whole notion of how we create better learning and better learning teams and better learning cultures around our organisations that intrigues me today is this notion of a new teamwork and what it means to bring people together and to genuinely have them collaborate, and why I would contend so strongly that learning and upskilling are the two battlegrounds, the two areas that we need to focus most significantly upon if we're genuinely interested in having people collaborate at the highest possible level. Now, I guess if I step behind that, I want to just spend a little bit of time today telling you about why I made the choice to run a webinar around this topic. And it's because I think that the notion, specifically in organisations and in businesses, that teamwork is a generic thing that we can pick up the way that other teams operate in other domains and then apply some of the rules behind those effective teams to our own environment, is becoming increasingly flawed. In fact, I think the old notion of why you would bring a team together used to be reasonably generic, and that was because we wanted to win. We were trying to be competitive. And the issue around that competition aspect when it comes to teams is that in a competitive environment, we encourage certain behaviours that we don't necessarily wish to have in the collaborative environment. Now, I would go back to my days of being an educator, and I often think back to certain behaviours that I was trying to encourage from my students as a teacher. And I remember a class that I had once who they were getting towards the end of the year and getting a bit ratty and a bit tired and a bit frustrated with each other, a bit over each other, if we're really honest. And so I decided that we needed a behavioural focus for a couple of weeks, and I brought in the notion of kindness. That what I was going to do in their little tables that they were sitting at, that were all delineated by colour, I was going to hand out tables points for acts of kindness. I found a couple of things that were interesting. Number one is that when what the kids found, what I found was that the students would only demonstrate acts of kindness if they thought they were going to be immediately rewarded for it. So I would see students glancing at me to make sure I was paying attention before they offered to sharpen a pencil for another class member. And I would sort of roll my eyes and go, yes, okay, well done, that's 2 points to the green team, and put that in my little envelope where I was keeping score. What I found at the end of the week, the other thing I found that I thought was interesting, was that at the end of the week, I pulled the kids together and for a bit of a chat about how the week had gone and what they got out of the week and what they thought they'd improved at. And I think it's always good to do a little bit of reflection on that. And the kids were just totally distracted. And I said, "What's the go, guys?" I said, "Do you just really want to know the score, do you?" And they said, "Yeah, we just want to know who won." And so I pulled them a little scorecard out of the envelope and I said to them, "Okay, the winning team is the yellow team." And the yellow team stood up and went, "Yes!" and gave the big finger to the blue team, who they'd been rivals with for the whole week. And I thought to myself, I may have missed the point on kindness. So I hadn't actually embedded it in them. All I'd done was make it a competitive mechanism, a competitive lever. And increasingly, the new team, when we bring people together, we're actually not asking them to compete. We're asking them to collaborate. And that's why learning and upskilling are so important, because if we want people to come together, we want people to work together, we need to get them improved and we need to build their capacity together. The old team needed to win, needed to compete. The new team, we need to achieve, we need them to improve, we need them to disrupt, we need them to create, and more than anything, we need them to collaborate. I was talking even recently with a colleague who works in radio, and he was talking to me about the fact that they have 3 presenters on air, and the 3 presenters in what they're trying to do is to compete with the other radio stations. And I was saying, yeah, are they really though? I said, because your competition in this scenario isn't even present. It's not like the one radio station's in another radio station battling each other the way that the old if you've ever seen the wonderful movie Anchorman, the way that the news teams come together and have a big battle in the park, it just doesn't happen like that, and that's what looks ridiculous when they do. They're actually, their task, if they want to win, if they want to achieve competitive advantage, is to collaborate more effectively than other teams collaborate. And so when we're talking in terms of future teams, what we're really talking about is, can we improve connection? can we improve the synergy? Can we improve the effectiveness of the connection between teams, between team members, in order that what they produce, one, are collaborative behaviours, and two, that they're actually getting back to that whole, that old adage about teams that, it's, great teams are more than the sum of their parts. And so that's what we're on about today. So what I want to do today is to take a broad view of what's really going on with teams, what needs to happen with teams considering where business and organisation is going at the moment, and how we can then, in a ridiculously practical kind of way, how we can give you some tips and tools and tricks that you can get started with tomorrow in order to be able to improve team effectiveness. So what I want to do, I guess, to kick it off is to show you a little bit about where the world's going in this, and the way that we need people to work together. I'm often referring to it's probably my go-to study on the future, is this whole notion that the Institute for the Future that came out of the University of Phoenix in the States, and what they did was they looked at some of the drivers of where the world's going in terms of the way people will work in the future. A couple of interesting ones are, how do we get our heads around the fact that so many of today's jobs will be automated in the future, and what are the challenges of that, but certainly what are the opportunities within that, because there's challenges in that, if you're in if you say a bricklayer, there are already wonderful videos that you can watch, excuse me, already wonderful videos that you can watch that show you how machines can now lay bricks to design more effectively and about 8 times quicker than a team of bricklayers. So that task is certainly in significant peril of being overtaken as machines come through. But there are certain things that people will definitely need to still perform, and they're the things that machines are no good at. So if you think about where the world's going, let's say in the next 15 years we found a cure for cancer. What do you think that does to our population in terms of its age profile? What it means is we will have an incredibly, a much higher proportion and cohort of older people in our community. So the work that machines can't do is in catering for aged people in aged care. So there's an industry there that's about to get much bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's the people skills within that are really important. So the University of Phoenix, through the Institute of the Future, took some of that those drivers into account, and then said, what are the work skills that we think people are going to need from 2020 and beyond to be incredibly relevant, to maintain or to establish competitive advantage? And what they came up with was these 10 skills, which I think are fascinating. And what I did when I looked at them, instead of being fascinated by them, I thought, okay, am I on the right path here? This whole notion of learning, upskilling and teamwork, if you look at those 3 green dots at the bottom of the screen there, where do these apply? Do they apply? And what I found myself noticing was that there were 3 that applied very significantly to this notion of being able to learn. So novel and adaptive thinking, being able to if you will, metaphorically think outside the box. Computational thinking, which means can you handle large amounts of interesting and difficult data, and can you make sense of that? And then this whole notion of cognitive load management, which I find hilarious. I think cognitive load management is basically, do you have a decent bullshit meter? And I spoke about this in a newsletter a couple of weeks ago. And it's basic. Cognitive load management is the ability to perform a Google search, notice that there are 7 million responses, and to be able to look through each of them and say bullshit, 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 bullshit. That's the useful one. Because it's not just the collection of information that's important anymore. It's the ability to handle the sheer volume of that information and still find something useful. And then I had a look at what were the ones that were very clearly inclined towards that upskilling, that capacity building. And I looked at these notions of sense building, new media literacy. We need to get more aware of the way that our key ideas are going to play out in the media. Transdisciplinarity, which means that, it's a big word, that means we have to understand the way that a concept can work not only in our own market or in our own discipline, but across various silos within your organisation, but also across various markets. And this notion of design mindset I find really interesting, because even from an education perspective, far too much of our educative processes are the bottom of what we would a model designed by Benjamin Bloom, which was Bloom's taxonomy, which is really about knowledge and comprehension. Can I force feed you this, and hopefully you might even understand it? Design mindset means we need to go to the top of Bloom's model, which is, can you design with it? Can you analyze with it? Can you evaluate with it? Can you judge with it? Can you create with it? And so hugely important that for us to be relevant in the future, for our teams to be relevant, that we've got people who are capable of that mindset. And then it's about teamwork. Social intelligence, the ability to work with other people, the ability to work with other people in a cross-cultural way. Can you bring people together who are diverse, and can you value that diversity rather than have it as an anchor on the way your team performs? And then this whole notion that's emerging around virtual collaboration, which means, can we establish teams that aren't even in the same place together? And can we do that effectively? Because the truth is, we have flexible work arrangements in place already, where people are contributing through working from home offices, and that will increasingly become the way. And what that will do is drag us, our teams, our organisations and our businesses closer and closer to being a world economy, and less away from their existence within a purely Western or national or local economy. So hugely important to have those skills in place, and I just can't find one there that sits outside that those three notions of learning, upskilling and teamwork. So that's, I guess, my frame for today, and where I think this can go. And like I said, they're kind of big concepts. So what I want to do is to bring it down to 5 notions and 5 concepts that sit behind a really effective team. For us to do that, what I'd love to do is to be able to contextualise it today. So while I've been rabbiting on for that first 10 minutes or so, making sure that you've got a really good frame for what we're going to be learning about today, I also really want to encourage you to step up and be a part of this. We've got people online who I know, by having a little look at my attendee list today, have certainly been a part of teams before, and know not only what their individual contribution to that is, but what are those synergies that we're kind of aiming at here to build a really effective team. And I'd love your input. So a couple of ways that you can interact today. One is that you can use the question box or the chat box as it may appear on your screen in your control panel. Depends a little on which version of the software you've got. But I'm going to keep a little eye on that question box. You'll notice me, just sort of, go vacant and blank for a little moment occasionally. And it might just be that I'm checking the question box just to see if there's anybody that's put anything in there yet. So if you've got anything that you think you can contribute, or you want to ask, or you're looking for clarity on, then please whack a question in there. You can also use the question box just if you're, there's a couple of names that I can see on our attendee list today that are new. And if you haven't used GoToWebinar before, then, and you're having a technical issue, then don't just sit there in silence while you may be experiencing silence. Whack a question in there. We've got the wonderful Chris, who's my business manager, who's online, who is my tech support when it comes to webinars. So we can help you out with that if you're having any issues accessing the webinar. And you know what? This is an old school learning environment through a new school means sometimes, because you'll see on your control panel a little hand, which means you can put your hand up. And if you do put your hand up, I've got the facility at my end to just unmute you, and we can verbally hear your question and make this a little bit more of a conversation, a little bit more of a connection, because after all, that's what I'm banging on about today. So let's get cracking with what those 5 different components are of a truly connected, truly collaborative team. Number 1 is the whole notion of personal connection and getting acquainted, actually getting to know each other. Often we bring people together in teams and we make the purpose of that team very clear. We might make roles within that team very clear, and then we hope that they'll get to work on it. And the truth is that even when it comes to things like workplace bullying, we haven't done anything to mitigate that until we create personal connection. The number 1 protective factor against workplace bullying, bullying being a negative power influenced interaction between people. The number 1 protective factor against it is just knowing things about each other. So hugely important that we find ways to bring people together and to strengthen personal connection before we start to think about whether they can achieve something professionally together. So what's a handful of ways that you could work on this? First of all, I saw a ripper recently, and as a couple of people who I know online will be very, very aware, that I never miss an opportunity to talk about the Richmond Football Club. I'm a little bit obsessed, and it's been a very fun few weeks. I read a book recently about their 2017 season, and found that they'd been through a process called the 3H process. And I actually discovered that the way that it had been rolled out in other places that I thought was more effective, which is the 4H process. I can see Simon online's already disgusted that I've decided to mention Richmond so early in the webinar today. Apologies, mate, but it's the way it's going to go. And what I found interesting about them, and I think when you look at even when you analyse why they were successful, is that, you know, even when you look at their list, and there's been data about the list of the individuals at the Richmond Football Club, and I think they ranked for the last season at about the ninth most talented team in the AFL. But what they did throughout the season, and it began very early in their work, was they went through this process called the 4Hs, where they'd each player get up and share personal information about themselves. And the 4Hs were where people share their heroes, their hardships, their hopes, and their highlights. And I ran this activity recently with a school leadership team in country Victoria. And what they told me at the end of it was that there's a couple of new people within that team. And what they told me at the end of it was that they just felt there was a higher level of trust within their team once they had gotten to know each other personally, where they felt that there was more to work on. They felt that it was easier to work together once they had taken the time to actually connect personally, that they felt there was more to leverage as they moved into looking to work professionally. Another one of the activities you could play that is really, really simple little ways to get this going, it would be I would be played by. So you're asking people to think about if there was a movie made about their life, why a certain actor would be chosen to play them and why. So you're getting them to talk a little bit about what is the character that they bring and what are the traits that they're bringing to the team that they would like to have recognised rather than criticised. And even one that I actually did this as with a staff, and I say I as though I can take credit for it. It was a fellow leader in the leadership team asked us to bring in a weekend suitcase, which the suitcase was a shoebox, and she would hand a shoebox to us and say, when you come in on Monday, I want you to put 4 or 5 items in there that would demonstrate to us your weekend. And people would come in on the Monday morning with, perhaps an empty beer bottle, but also there might be a cricket ball in there, or there might be a tent peg from their camping trip, or there might be a picture of their family because they'd done a family visit to somebody that they hadn't seen for a while. And what that did for us was start to build, like I mentioned before, it's a really important word, that leverageable personal connection, which means it's something that you can use to, you can use for professional gain as well as you move forward. All right, so first step, get acquainted, get to know each other, hugely important in terms of teams. Don't go straight to purpose. Let's spend a little bit of time at the start and in an ongoing way of strengthening personal connection. The second one I want to talk about here is this whole notion of establishing some sort of team identity. It can be really important to create, and what a team identity does is it creates for people a sense of belonging. So a notion that in this space, and even whether it's a physical or a virtual space, but in this space, I belong, I'm a part of this. I feel a high level of two things. I feel a high level of support and I feel a high level of accountability. When you have a high level of support and accountability, what happens is that it becomes a very respectful environment. People talk about respect as though it's just being nice to each other or tolerating each other in some way. The truth is that respect is all about high expectation and high level of support. So what happens within those respectful environments is that roles and tasks are far more likely to be fulfilled, because in this place, that's what we do. So positive behaviours become very quickly normalised and become cultural norms when we have a strong sense of identity. Now, what do you do to achieve that? The first one can be a really simple one, which is establish a team name. I recently, a couple of years back now, went on a family holiday with my extended family, and so there was a large group of us together staying in a great big holiday house on the on the escarpment of Port Douglas there. It was a wonderful time, and a group of 6 of us went fishing one afternoon on a fishing charter. And as we got onto the boat, what we had to do was to pick our colour. So they gave us a bunch of ties, which meant that if we caught a fish, we had to put it in the, we had to put a little tie on it to signify which team had caught it. And we were Team Brown. And look, if we're really speaking frankly to each other, it's probably because we looked like the most shit fishermen as we walked onto the boat that we were given the name of Team Brown. But we wore that as a badge of honour. So it didn't matter even that we had a rather crummy team name. What mattered was that it was ours. And so there's various little things that you can do there, like even just establishing a team name, establishing a fun little team handshake can be a fun thing to do as well. And even going a step further, one of the activities that I did with my staff once was to ask them about collaboration karaoke, which meant tell us what's the song that best describes the way we're going to work together as a team, through the good times and the bad, which if you just go and Google that, you'll find that in millions and millions of songs. And I said to them, by the way, we're going deep here. We're not doing We Are the Champions by Queen because it's the most obvious one about the victory of a competitive team. I want you to go a little further. And, I remember even recently the staff that I was working with came up with the song Team by Lord, or another came up with Black and White by Michael Jackson, and another came up with the very eloquent Tub Thumping by Chumbawamba. Go and look that one up if you haven't heard of it before. It's got some very interesting lyrics in there. But what it's really about is the most interesting lyric, or the most pertinent one, I suppose, within that song is, I get knocked down, but I get up again. You're never going to keep me down. And so what they were saying was that we needed to have a fierce determination that we know we're going to get problems here. We know that it's going to be difficult and we're going to find challenges that we haven't been able to foresee. But when they come, we're not giving up. And I love the way that they described that to me. And I love the reason that they picked that song, despite the constant alcohol references within it. So establishing a sense of identity around your team can be a really valuable thing to do. Next thing that's really important to do is to make support, particularly mutual support, the way that we're going to look after each other, the way that we're going to assist each other, make it explicit. Now, what I'm talking about there is not letting it be implicit. I talk in my work with educational institutes and schools about how you can teach behaviours, how you can teach social skills, even how you can teach them to kids, and which is a really interesting one when you're trying to teach, responsibility to 5-year-olds. But I tell them that there's a 3-step process about how you teach a behaviour that we really need to keep in mind. And number one is that what we want to do is to be able to teach it explicitly, which means don't imply. We don't want to allow support to be implied within a team. We want to have spoken to it explicitly, which means that we've attached language to it. You look at even the old defence forces and some of the mantras that they have, and how they are explicitly designed to make support part of the way they function. Think about the expression "no man left behind," and how that could be applied to a multitude of high stress environments and situations, but how the application of that mantra means that people will behave in a certain way because we just don't leave anybody behind. So number one is to make sure that we're very explicit about what the behaviour is we're looking for, not implicit, just hoping that people will behave in a supportive way. The second thing you want to do is apply it to a non-threatening situation. So a couple of those little ideas you can use to try and build team include things like the care lift. It's just a fun little activity where you get one team member to lie still on the ground, and we might have 6 team members around them, and their job is to try and lift them from a lying position to a standing position without their body bending or becoming or them feeling uncomfortable. So you need 1 or 2 people to stand near the head, and we're going to lift that up first, and we're going to supportively then lift their hips to help them get up a little higher, and then we're going to hold onto their feet to make sure that they find their way all the way up into a vertical position. And it implies to people that when we're in a high pressure or a situation that we feel uncomfortable, people, that it's really that it's really important that everybody plays their role, even if that role isn't exactly the same. Blind walk is another one that I'm a bit of a fan of. I think that it's really good fun to set up some sort of environment and ask people to put a blindfold on and have another person guide them through that, whether it's a physical or guide or whether it's a verbal guide. It's a good way to establish trust. And another one, to be really honest, and if we want to get a little bit more practical here in terms of the team, is to talk in advance about what are the rules of engagement when things go wrong. How is it that we're going to resolve conflict, for instance? How is it that in a team, because a team is a team with a purpose, particularly if there is even any element of a competitive angle within that team, is a highly emotional state. It can be a highly emotional place, and by virtue of those emotions is inconsistent. And so we have to be aware that people won't behave the same way every day. They won't even behave the same way during a day. We all know people who, can be the nicest pie in the morning, and by the afternoon they've completely run out of juice and you just want to run a mile from them. So what we want to do is to know in advance, how is it that we're going to deal with that? So one that I've seen work really well is that when we have a problem, when we have conflict, we work through it in 9 minutes, which means that we have 3 minutes where we discuss the past, 3 minutes, and we just say what's gone wrong from your point of view. We won't agree, but let's just get it off our chest. 3 minutes where we talk about the present, where we talk about the damage or the impact. How's this making people feel? How is it having an impact on your ability to perform your role within the team at this moment? And then 3 minutes on the future. What are you going to do? And you don't get to say what you want the other person to do. You just get to say what you're going to do to make that situation a little bit better. And I've known teams that have had people, because I guess one of the things about teams that can be really fraught is that we can bring people together and get them to work really closely because they've got a great relationship existing, perhaps even a good friendship. And we put that friendship at peril when we give them something difficult to do. And if we don't have a way of resolving that conflict, we haven't thought about that in advance, then very quickly we can go from negative emotion to completely cutting off from that relationship entirely. Now that's no good for relationships, but it's also no good for your team. It's corrosive for your team. So what we want to do, I guess those 3 steps that I mentioned before about social skills, is to be explicit about the language, no man left behind. Practice it in a non-threatening way, and the care lift and the blind walk are great examples of that. And then what we want to do, step 3, is apply it to the real world. And that seems that design their rules of engagement, about 3 for the past, 3 for the present, and 3 for the future. On to number 4, and this is about valuing and celebrating uniqueness. Now, I would contend to you that past teams have not been so good at this. What we look for in the past to build a great team is uniformity. We look for clones, and we look to, I guess, either tolerate or extinguish differences. Really strong collaborative teams are very clear about the fact that people can bring all sorts of different stuff. And if we spend a really long time trying to improve the deficiencies that individuals within our teams have, then we often spend a very small amount of time benefiting from their strengths. The things that they are, like Jedi Master level at, get quashed and get pushed to the side because we're so busy working on what they can't do. Now, for instance, if I was to be brought into a team, let's say I'm being brought into a circus troupe, and they said, look, you're in the circus troupe now, and the gap that we've got here is in the juggling team. Now, I'm a big guy with very little natural coordination. If they told me that I needed to learn how to juggle to be in the troupe, then we're going to spend a long time on that, and we're possibly going to get very little return for investment on the time that I spend working on that deficiency. But you know what, if they just, because I'm a big guy, if they just said, well, what we need you to do is to go over there to that little activity where you've got to take a hammer and hit the bell and try and hit it harder than anybody else that's coming along, then I've got a chance. It's a strength, and I can work from a strength-based position, and it actually gives people something to value and celebrate. about my unique contribution that I can give to the circus troupe. So I think back to, even people that I've worked with, like I had one staff member when I was the principal of a school, and it just felt like every time I presented a new notion or a new idea that Amali would shoot it down. And what I realised, that if you know your Edward de Bono coloured hats, and what I realised was that Amali was a black hatter, which meant she could just see the problems with any idea very early. And it was actually a strength. But I was encountering it as an incredible weakness. It was causing me enormous frustration. So what I needed to do, just to adjust, to be able to celebrate that skill that Amali had, was to, before a meeting where I might present a new idea or a new direction, new initiative, new program, about 2 days before, I would send Amali an email telling her what I was thinking about. And she would write the email back to me with all of the reasons that it was going to fail. I would make adjustments to my plan, because the truth is she was better at seeing into the future for those pitfalls than I was, and make those adjustments. And by the time I did present it at the meeting, most people thought that, by the time I did present it at the meeting, Amali basically was acting like it was her idea, which was a much more conducive role for her to play than the anchor or the obstacle role that she was playing at that time. Which meant for me, the lesson was just, don't let Amali's strength become an anchor on what you're trying to do. Let it help, value it, celebrate it, and see what we can achieve. You've also, I guess, got to find out what they are. A couple of really fun little practical ways that you can do that. A values matrix is a good way to find out what the unique things are that people are into. I've done an activity where I've asked people I've listed 10 values and asked them to list for me out of 10 how valuable they are. Can you rank these from, 1 would be the one that you value the most, and 10 would be what you value the least. And I've asked them, 10 values, things like world peace, family security, happiness, excitement, helping others, harmony, salvation, wisdom, wealth, health. So there's 10, and ask people to rank them in terms of importance for themselves, and getting them to compare them amongst team members. That gets them to go, oh wow, that's not quite what I'm into. But when I find out that my score for excitement is significantly lower than somebody else's score for excitement, what I can do is make them my excitement guru. When they really need to, when I really need to put some energy into something, I need to get somebody, who can get the motivation and the inspiration going, then I'm going to go over to that excitement guru and enlist their help. And you can't do it unless you know those things about each other. Preference continuums are good fun. You just find out about the way people tick. I use continuums where you might just draw that standard continuum line that just is, just 2 arrows on the end of a horizontal line. And then on one end, put adventure movies, and on the other end, put comedies, and just say, where do you stand? Where on the continuum best describes you? Well, which one do you like more than the other, and by how much? You can do all sorts of silly ones like, ice cream on one end and cake on the other, or beaches on one hand and mountains on the other, dogs on one end, cats on the other. And then you can actually extend it further into work concepts as well. So it might be, starting projects versus project completion. What floats your boat, what really gets you going. And when we know those things about each other, we can both support where there's a deficiency, and we can encourage, thank, and congratulate people when they do get going. And I love this whole idea now that one of my most fun activities that I've ever done with the staff was in trying to find out about what's unique and what's really different about what makes them tick. I love this activity of letting people know that, okay, you're a heart transplant surgeon and you've had a new heart come in, but you've got 5 potential people who could receive their heart transplant, and they all need it just as much. And we talk through the 5 different scenarios. So I've got John, who's a 35-year-old actor. He's divorced. His wife has custody of the kids, and he donates a huge amount of money to create shelters for the homeless. You've got Howard, who's a 55-year-old politician. He's married, he has 1 kid. He's recently been brought into government, and he's financially quite well off. You've got Anne, who's a 45-year-old housewife. She's a widow. She supports 3 kids. She has very little income and very little savings. You've got George, who's a 61-year-old underworld figure. He's married, he's got 7 kids, he's very wealthy, but he does donate a lot of that wealth to a local hospital, and he's promised to double that donation to the hospital if he receives the heart. And you've got Peter, who's a 23-year-old student at university. He's single, he studies really hard, and he also on the side has supports a charity that helps poor people. He wants to be a policeman when he graduates. And you ask people, who's getting the heart? And the conversation that comes out of that is quite amazing. And you find out so much about what people value, and you find out so much about what people want to bring to a team. So they're great ways to, not only celebrate, but for me to identify what it is that's unique about the team members that you have, and to work from strength rather than always trying to cover for inadequacies. And the last one that I want to talk to today is this whole notion of within teams developing genuine synergy. And I think it's really important. This goes back to that. Are we prepared to test this notion that our team should be greater than the sum of its parts? Is our team genuinely collaborative, or has it become a competitive beast where within the team people might still be scrapping for their own advantage? Is there still a pecking order or a status hierarchy within our team? And some of the great little practical things that you can do in tending to the soil of your team include things like the desert survival game. This is a fun one. I really like this, where you provide for people a scenario, which is that you've been on a plane that has crashed in the desert, and there's nothing to be seen all around you. It's flat terrain. The temperature's 38 degrees Celsius. You've been able to scramble with your remaining survivors to pull 14 items from the plane before it has burst into flames. And the 14 things you've got are a pistol. You've got a book on edible animals of the desert. You've got a bottle of 1,000 salt tablets. You've got a litre of water per person, a red and white parachute, a compress kit with gauze. You've got a map of the area, a flashlight, a knife, a raincoat, a warm coat per person, 2 pairs of sunglasses, a mirror, and a magnetic compass. And it's asking people to rank for you the importance of those items, which is the one that's the most important to have in that scenario and which is the least. Now, it's reasonably open-ended in that for whatever reason people might choose a certain object, but then if you let them know that the US Air Force has actually done this activity previously and they know the right and wrong answers, that people really start to think about, okay, we're going to have to, what would we use, how would we work together? And these synergistic kind of behaviours start to come together in the way that they do it, because why? We've got to survive here. We need to make this decision the right way. So just so you're fully aware here that the US Air Force reports that the number one thing that you need to value is the mirror. Hugely important because of its ability to reflect the sun, and it can reflect the sun for several miles around, including upwards. So that means your likelihood of being rescued and seen in an air search is much higher if you're using the mirror. And the most useless thing apparently in the list is the bottle of salt tablets. So getting them to that point of being able to debate and have argy-bargy is all about the connection, all about how we'd work together to survive that circumstance and why we would use certain tools a certain way. Moving on from there, you can go on to things like team statements, which I find a really interesting thing to do. They can be, I don't know, they can be really, if I can speak colloquially again here, they can be really wanky. So we could come up with big mission statements that, to be really honest, are just aspirations and don't honestly reflect what we're trying to do or how we're trying to do it. I think one of the mission statements that I really am a bit of a fan of is the one the website company Squarespace, mainly because it's simple. And it just lets people know that, if there's nothing outside, anything that we're doing outside the mission, outside the team statement, is probably not all that important. It's probably, surplus to need. Squarespace's mission is we make beautiful products to help people with creative ideas succeed. That's it. That's all they do. Another one that springs to mind would be from the successful Australian America's Cup campaign from way back in the 80s. And what their agreement was that they would ask a question for every decision that they were making, which was, does it make the boat go faster? And if it didn't, if there was really no discernible impact on that, then they were wasting their time, and they weren't going to work. They weren't going to do that together, because what they want for their people is return. They want return on investment for the time and effort that they put in. Even the whole idea of it, if you want to get down to really basic activities, because you can't be bothered doing the big desert survival argument, is squiggle art is a great way to get people to come together and work in a collective way, regardless of the quality of the work that other people do on a particular day. So start with a squiggle, pass it to one person, get the next person to add something over only a 10-second period, and then pass it on. And no matter what the quality, good or bad, of the person previous's work, your job is to make it better. Your job is to add a little bit more, and together to try to create something worthwhile. So a great way to, I guess, that social skill idea again, of being able to, one, be explicit about what we're trying to do, two, apply it in a fun, non-threatening and a non-life or death kind of situation. And then you can take even that notion of squiggle art and ask people, like, okay, we've got a big project to take on in terms of squiggle art here. How are we tackling it? How are we going to build on each other's work? Hugely important if you want to develop genuine synergy within your teams. All right, everyone. Oh, wow. I feel like I need to just take a breath there. I've been going at a million mile an hour, I think, today. If you have any questions, I guess I really want to encourage you now to jump into that question box or to put your hand up. While you're thinking about what your questions are, just a couple of things to finish off our webinar today. Number one is that I want to remind you that the handout from today, the slide deck is available to you in the control panel as a handout. So please make it available to yourself. I really want to thank you for coming along and giving up your time to share in this notion of building new teams. And your reward for that is that you get this slide deck to take away and to be able to ponder and make some notes on and to steal some ideas. I've often said that great leadership is 90% theft. So I really want you to have those available to you as you move forward from here. Just want to go here. Simon's asked a question here, which is a really interesting one, was where does the notion of trust fit into the equation for me? Trust is a really important component, and I think trust within a team is built on two things. Number one is it's built on being able to thank, and then two, congratulate people for very specific behaviours, because they become the behaviours that we expect of each other. So Simon, for me, trust is a trait. You know, we trust each other in the way that we're going to behave, which means I can tell with a high degree of confidence what you're going to do in a variety of circumstances. But to just ask people to trust each other isn't enough. What we need to do is to start ridiculously specific. So if we're looking for somebody to say, you know, and one I saw recently was we had a school that I was working with the leadership of their school, and one of their values, a big word or a trait, is respect. And I thought that was a bit wishy-washy. And to be honest, it's the most common value in Australian schools, and nearly every teacher tells me that Australian schools have a problem with respect. So it's not working, just naming it as respect. But the thing that I loved was that they had about 6 or 7 behaviours that meant respect to them as a staff. And the one that I liked the most was clearly the most specific, which was just that in meetings you turn your mobile phone off. There was one in there about always speaking respectfully to staff members, but I can argue that. But when somebody is clearly, it's binary, it's they either did it or they didn't around the specific behaviour. When someone walks in, grabs their phone, turns it off, I as a leader have the opportunity to say, thanks for living up to that, really appreciate it, really respectful thing to do. And that becomes a cultural norm very quickly. So I think if we want to build trust, we need to start very, very specific. And it gives us the chance to thank and congratulate people, which is a really positive thing as well. Just going to keep moving here through. We've got a couple of other questions that have come through. Nazan has asked, how do you deal with staff who just seem to not want to get involved? And Nazan, I'd hate to give you the same advice, but what we're looking for is, I guess, 2 things. Number one is we're looking for that to be incredibly specific. And then number 2 is what I think we want to do is to frame that conversation from a strength-based perspective. So people who are lazy, who don't want to get involved, we go away and we talk about them being lazy, and other people are allies in our frustration for us. But if we go and talk to someone about their laziness, what happens is they're likely to tell us to get stuffed. You know, I'm not lazy, I get a lot done. I do lots of bits and pieces. Leave me alone. What are you picking on me for? That guy over there, he's just as lazy as me. And that people who are lazy don't realise they're lazy. They think they're laid back. And so when we can talk to them from a strength perspective about how laid back they are, and what the impact of that might be on other people. If you thought about how other people perceive your laid back nature, then they can start to make some reflections for themselves about what they need to do, what they need to change or improve. To be honest, they ain't changing anything unless we can get them to realise it for themselves. Now, sometimes you'll leverage relationship to be able to hit them right between the eyes, but if you can't leverage that because their relationship isn't strong enough yet, or they're just not that kind of person that's very reflective, then what we need to do is to position that conversation from a strength, so that we can then ask them to think about the perception of that strength from other people's perspective. Hope that answers your question, Nazan. Thank you so much for the contribution, Simon and Nazan. Really appreciate it. Just to let you know too, there's obviously a lot of work that we could do together around this notion of team building effectively in your organisation. If you'd like to have a yarn with me about that, any of those words, this is the work we do. So if you want to have a chat about workshops or keynotes or some coaching and training, or even we've been working through a handful of really long-term partnerships with organisations where we're bringing all of this theory around learning and capacity building to bear in a multitude of different kinds of ways, then just whack that word in there in the question box, and I certainly will be following up with an email and a phone call to you just to see if we can chew the fat a little bit to see what I might be able to do to help you out. The last thing I want to do, I guess, is just prime you for the next webinar. It's going to be on the 15th of March, and it's going to be about social skills. I feel funny because I'm often talking to teachers about how you teach social skills, and I thought, well, it's very a kid-oriented area. And then when I started to do a lot more work in the corporate space, I found that there are a whole bunch of adults who don't have social skills either. And when I'm talking to leaders or team coordinators, what they often tell me is that what they're dealing with is behaviour and the absence of social skills in people. And so, Nazan, this might be relevant to your question as well. What I want to do in the next webinar is show you how you can foster those kinds of skills, those kinds of collaborative skills that are really the hallmarks of a really effective team also, but also the hallmarks of an effective individual and an improving individual and a motivated individual within your organisation. So you're going to get a link to that one. Really want to encourage you to come along to that one, and we'll give you more information, not only with those lazy ones, Nazan, but also, for instance, the arrogant ones or the rude ones or the interruptive ones or the self-obsessed ones, and how you can try and flip some of those negative labels around into things that we actually value about them as well. Hey, if you'd like to stay in touch, please do. Really happy to have a yarn with you about either the content of today's webinar or anything else that might be on your mind or what's coming up for you. So please feel free to use that number and that email address and those web addresses there to stay in touch. I want to thank you again. Really appreciate you coming along today. Really appreciate the interaction from the people who've done that. And want to encourage you to have a fantastic week, and I'll see you next time.